So good day, everybody. Welcome to our seminar. In representation of the Business Finance Center at Adolfo Ibañez University Business School, we welcome you to this seminar. First of all, thanks to the World Bank Research and Development Center in Chile for inviting us to join the organize this seminar, in which we expect to discuss the economic activity projections for this year and next, and the conditions that might catalyze or hamper from recovery, with special attention to the delicate balance between the short-term and longer-term concerns during this crisis, and to the more structural vulnerabilities that have been exposed during this past year. We thank all the prominent speakers who accompany us today. All of them have extensive economic policy experience and have been very generous to share their insights on these topics from their different vantage points at key international organizations. At the business school, we're part of the business system and the economy of the Latin American region, and we feel it is our responsibility to do what we can to help in these circumstances, and participating in instances of analysis and reflection, such as the one we're about to have today, is part of that commitment. We want to maintain the capacity to offer real learning and be a resource to develop the region, and the scope of this event beyond our national borders undoubtedly contributes to achieving that objective. Thank you, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are in the world. Sergio.
Well, welcome and good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everybody. This is another event that we are organizing from the World Bank Development and Research Center in Chile. This is a joint event that we are doing with the Universidad Adolfo Ibañez, with the World Bank East Asia Pacific Chief Economist Research Hub in Malaysia. And we have another successful event, more than 500 participants in different continents. So we want to thank our partners. We want to thank Andrea for chairing the panel, Norman, Maria, and Eric that are connecting from Kuala Lumpur, Rome, Washington. And this is a great honor for us to have the perspectives of both the World Bank, the IMF, the IDB on this important topic about the path to recovery from the pandemic. We have an excellent panel. We are blessed that we have you. And the registered participants will be able to not see each other, but they can ask questions through the chat. Some people are connecting through WebEx, other people are connecting through YouTube. So please feel free to ask questions, and we will channel, Juliana will channel the questions to Andrea, who will answer, try to ask the questions to the panelists and organize the discussion at the end. And for those that cannot participate in the event live, we will share the video that will be posted in the website and circulated later for wider viewing. Without further ado, let me pass the baton to Andrea so she can start the panel. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
I need to unmute. Yeah, thank you everyone for organizing this meeting. Thank you all the participants, 400 participants I understand might join us today from all over the world. Today we're going to learn about this research and policy brief about the recovery from the pandemic crisis, balancing short-term and long-term concerns. We'll start by the presentation of the brief and the discussion, the presentation by Norman Loaiza from the World Bank, and then a discussion by Jan Maria and Eric from IMF and IDB. So I'll let Norman start with his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Thanks, Sergio and Julio, for that nice introduction. Let me share the content of my presentation. Sergio, I think you need to give me access. All right. All right. Well, I'm really honored to to share this panel with Gianmaria Milesi Ferretti and Eric Parrado, both of whom I have known and admired for many years. Today, I will present some work that some colleagues at the World Bank, Purva Sanji, Lina Shaharuddin, and Lucy Wooster, and I have written on the recovery from the pandemic crisis. And I hope that this presentation will actually serve as an introduction to the remarks that Gianmaria and Eric will make. It bears repeating that this crisis is like no other. The pandemic crisis that we are experiencing this year shares some similarities with other crises. For instance, natural hazards, wars, macroeconomic mismanagement that can lead to, for instance, hyperinflation, or international financial meltdowns like the one we had in 2009. But I think it is fair to say that this pandemic has the worst characteristics, combines the worst features of all these crises. And one way of understanding this is by looking at the characteristics of shocks that cause crisis, different types of crisis. And the pandemic has a combination of a simultaneous supply and demand shock. Its scope goes beyond the domestic and regional to reach a global dimension. The duration of this crisis is projected to be long, and although all crises are uncertain, there are some crises that are more uncertain than others, and a pandemic crisis falls in that latter category. Now, there are two ways of assessing how large a crisis is. One is by looking at the effects on economic growth, and the other is by looking at the effects of uncertainty. First, let's talk about growth briefly. In this graph, you can see the blue line represents the share of countries, of economies that are projected to be in a recession in 2020, and the red dots show the GDP per capita growth contraction. Now, what we see is that for the COVID-19 crisis, around 90% of economies will be suffering from a recession during this year, and the estimated contraction in GDP per capita is over -6%. So this is among the worst crises that we have seen, at least since in the 1870s, regarding growth. We look at uncertainty, and here I'm presenting a graph taken from a paper by Hirblum and Puccheri. They measure the level of uncertainty in the world through their World Uncertainty Index, and we can really see a peak of this index due to or related to the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. So sharp contraction in growth and high uncertainty characterizing this crisis. It is because of this that the Global Economic Prospects, a flagship publication of the World Bank, has concluded that it is the most adverse peacetime shock in over a century. Well, this is about the crisis. Now let's talk about the projected recovery, what people think about this recovery. And one way of understanding this crisis is by comparing it to previous crises. And the most recent of them is the one in 2009, the global financial crisis. Well, the 2020 crisis will be about 3 times worse in terms of global GDP growth than the corresponding decline in 2009. And whereas in 2009, there were 3 large regions, East Asia and Pacific, of course, includes China, South Asia, includes, of course, India, and Sub-Saharan Africa, had little or no decline in growth. In 2020, all regions around the world will suffer a contraction. Now, the depth of the contraction has bearing on the ability of countries to recover. And in fact, what we saw is that after the global financial crisis, developing countries had a large increase in GDP growth. And you could see that by looking at different regions, even different countries, and they all experienced an increase in 2010 relative to 2009, and maybe only advanced countries experienced a sluggish bounce back. In contrast, the recovery for 2021 is projected to be much less strong. In fact, it is projected that the countries will be able to regain only a fraction of what was lost during 2020, and it may take several years, maybe 5 years, or possibly even more, for these countries to recover what was lost during 2020 and go back to the trend. Now, according to the projections that we have seen, the countries that experience a larger contraction in 2020 are projected to also have larger expansions during 2021. Now, this may be maybe some degree of optimism, probably, but what we see is what is represented in this graph. In the horizontal axis, we have the GDP growth projection for 2020 relative to trend, and in the vertical axis, we have the growth projection for 2021. The dotted black line represents the inverted 45-degree line. And as we can see, the large majority of countries are below that inverted 45-degree line. The regression line is well below, of course, this 45-degree line. And what that shows is that although countries will be able to recover, or are projected to recover in 2021, the recovery will fall far short of what was lost in 2020. Now, these are the projections, but let's go deeper into what may constrain and actually drive the recovery. And for this, we need to think about some facts that we cannot, or the economies in the world cannot really escape. And I will underscore 3 facts. The first is that public health concerns will remain central, will remain paramount, whether by government regulations or by people's self-constraint. Economic activity will remain depressed as long as the threat of this disease is present. There are, of course, mitigation strategies that can minimize losses. Some of them are focalized quarantines. Some of them are based on testing, tracing, and isolating the infected, wearing masks, social distancing, and so on. But many governments have been unable or unwilling to implement them. And because of this public health concern remains so important. And in fact, here I will show you 2 graphs. The first is related to infection rates. On the left-hand side, you can see the average daily in the last 2 months, September and October. On the right-hand side, you see the trend, that is the difference from September to October. And what we see is that many countries are still in the midst of a high rate of infection, and the trend is looking really bad for many countries, especially in the northern hemisphere that are starting their winter time. And the same is happening actually with the mortality rate. It really mimics what happens with regards to infections. The second fact is that the negative external shock associated with the crisis will likely linger. The global response has been chaotic, has been uncoordinated, to say the least, and because of this external environment is likely to remain very volatile, and the activity in the external markets will likely remain volatile as well. And what we see is this pattern that is expressed here in a very simple way. External exposure and the negative impact of the shock are very clearly related. The higher the initial exposure, the more negative the impact of the shock. And this is true whether we look at trade, especially commodity exports, whether we look at tourism, remittances, or FDI inflows. In all these characteristics regarding international conditions, we see the same, that initial exposure to these conditions have determined how negative the impact of the shock has been. And the third fact that we need to keep in mind when thinking about the shapes of the recovery is that pre-existing conditions matter, and they are particularly relevant for developing countries. They, in fact, will have to navigate in the domestic front with large informality, low fiscal space, and public services that are really lacking and ineffective, particularly in healthcare. And on the external front, as I said before, these developing countries suffer from very large dependence on tourism, remittances, commodity exports, and international financing. Because of this, they will have a harder time recovering. We can think about the recovery in more abstract terms, but actually this taxonomy can help us understand what countries will be facing. And this looks like an alphabet of recovery shapes, but there is a meaning behind each of these letters. Well, we call an L-shaped recovery really a lack of recovery. There is a fall, but then there isn't really a jump up. And this can actually happen in countries that are unable to control the pandemic, and in countries that waste public resources with attempts of mitigation and recovery that fail. And in those cases, the pandemic may actually transform into other types of crises, a macroeconomic crisis, a debt crisis, a financial crisis. And once this happens, then the crisis and the recession involved in that crisis may last for many years. Now, there is also the possibility of a volatile recovery, and this may be what we see now in European countries. These are countries that use strict but unsustainable measures to control the pandemic, and this might lead to a cycle of openings, outbreaks, and lockdowns. Well, of course, this volatility can also be related to the external dependence that some countries have on external conditions. If these external conditions are volatile, then it is also likely that the recovery of these countries will be volatile. Now, the best scenario, of course, is what we call a V-shaped recovery. This is a rapid recovery after a shock. It is, however, unlikely when the depth and the uncertainty of the crisis are very large. Well, there are distributional consequences in recoveries, and this is what we can characterize as a K-shaped recovery. Some people, in fact, and businesses may do very well, may even profit from the crisis, while others face collapse and extreme poverty. Now, what we argue and try to argue in this research and policy brief is that this gradual recovery may be the most pragmatic scenario, and this recovery would occur based on, first, resilient fundamentals, and will be driven by a normal pace that is given by the resolution of the pandemic, for instance, through vaccination or effective treatment, and the normalization of global conditions. And in the brief, we provide a way of assessing the possibility to start and sustain recovery from the pandemic crisis based on different conditions. I don't have time now to present all this, but I invite you to read the brief to get a sense for this way of this framework for assessing this possibility for recovery. Let me end by talking briefly about something that we also stress in this brief, that we really need to see and think beyond the recovery and think about resilience as maybe a more viable concept. Now, the first question that we ask is whether it makes sense to seek a quick recovery through macro financial stimulus. And we argue that this may be misguided because it can lead to repeated waves of the pandemic, especially if this stimulus tries to accelerate economic activity while the threat of the virus is still present. It can also result in very large fiscal deficits. And these large fiscal deficits may not have the desired impact because multipliers are particularly low when there are the supply constraints given to the pandemic. And these large fiscal deficits may have then an impact on further crisis. And the last reason why we think that seeking for quick recovery may not be a good idea is that it may actually transform some measures that are just emergency measures into regular practice. And I am referring to the loss of central bank independence, lax financial regulatory policy that may lead to financial crisis in the future, and even industrial policies that may support industries and firms that are not viable in the long run. Beyond quick recovery, then, we see resilience as a goal. And in that case, this may be just a subtle difference, but we think that during this time, especially during times when the stimulus may not make a lot of sense, we should think about protecting the fundamentals of economic growth. We are referring to human capital, physical capital, productivity, and maybe other important components of production, but I will just highlight these three. On human capital, we argue that children really need to go back to school. They cannot afford to lose more time, and this is possible if some safety regulations are implemented. And in order not to lose more human capital, we need to keep up with the support for vulnerable families. For physical capital, in particular for investment, we believe that high-quality public investment should be stressed. Not every type of public investment, not just spending for the sake of increasing the aggregate demand, but actually focusing on high-quality projects. Fiscal moderation and policy certainty may encourage private investment even more than just reducing rates or providing credit guarantees. And in terms of productivity, avoiding unnecessary business closures is important because of all the important networks and relationships that are created through businesses. If these businesses close, then all these relations are broken, and that has a productivity effect. This is difficult because it's not very clear what businesses will remain viable after this pandemic. But what is very clear is that all these businesses will have to rely more on digital transformation, and therefore governments should facilitate online business practices. So lastly, just to conclude, then we know that it is hard to think about the positive side when we are in the middle of a crisis. But in fact, we have seen in the past that crises have begat reforms. And out of crisis, we have discovered ways of reforming, of making the economy better. And actually, in this crisis, there is the potential of doing the same. And we have seen through this crisis that some areas, or the crisis, I should say, has exposed certain areas that need reforming. One of them is the expansion of labor and business formalization, improving the coverage and adequacy of social protection, extension of financial inclusion to certain groups of people, like the elderly, rural, and poor people, the promotion of digital transformation for schools, businesses, and government, and the improvement of access to and quality of public healthcare. I think if we look at these reforms for the medium term, we may be preventing actual crisis in the future, or if not preventing the crisis, at least improving the ability of families, businesses, and governments to deal with those crises. So thank you very much. You can, of course, see more of this in our research and policy brief.
Thank you, Norman, for your very interesting presentation. We will now have Gian Maria Milesi Ferretti, who will give his remarks. Gian Maria is Deputy Director of the IMF's Western Hemisphere Department. Thank you, Gian Maria.
Thank you, Andrea. Let me share my screen and go to the presentation. First of all, it's an honor to be with you all today. It's also a personal pleasure to be with old friends on this panel. And I was reminiscing before with Norman. We go back a long time since grad school. And I am going to give you our take on the world economic outlook, but in doing that, I'm going to try to highlight, the many commonalities between our analysis and the one that Norman just presented. But I would be a bit more granular on how we see world economic developments now, and then turn to the policies towards the end of my presentation. The WEO was issued basically a month ago. And of course, a lot of things happened since. So I want also, for those of you that have looked at our numbers, that are going to see our numbers in the presentation, I'm going to give you a bit of a flavor of what we have learned over the past month and how that changes the way we see the outlook. So let me start with just a summary of the developments as we saw them in October compared to our previous take on world developments. As Norman highlighted, we had, a crisis like no other, and we had a dramatic fall in GDP across the world, basically with the exception of China, who had the fall a quarter before, in the second quarter of this year. And the numbers we are talking about are numbers that I think none of us, or nobody in the forecasting business, had ever thought they would likely see in terms of quarterly behavior of GDP, short of a very small country hit by a terrible earthquake or something like that. It turns out, though, that once we got the actual data for the second quarter, it was awful, but marginally less awful than we had expected as of June. Fundamentally, you had a big trough in April, and gradually economies started coming back. And for the most recent quarter, for which we finally now are beginning to get data, the third quarter of this year, the signs are that the pickup in activity was stronger, actually stronger than we put in our forecasts just a few weeks ago. Across the board. It's still an incomplete recovery, of course. We are not regaining the level of activity we had prior to the crisis, but the pickup has been quite noticeable, particularly, I would say, in advanced economies that had, of course, very severe second quarter contractions. Still, the situation remains very difficult, and we have a number of emerging economies. Latin America was hit particularly severely by the pandemic, but also India had a very severe hit, and second quarter growth figures were really terrible. And as you may know, we aggregate data to calculate world growth or emerging market growth, advanced economy growth, using the PPP weights that the World Bank publishes every few years. And India weighs at PPP much more than it does at market exchange rates. So the numbers you will see on growth for countries are, of course, the same. For aggregates, the numbers that the IMF publishes are a bit larger because they put more weight on emerging markets because of the PPP parities. The silver lining, if you have to find one, has been really the recovery in China, which has been much stronger than we were anticipating a few months ago. And you will see that more clearly once I get to talk about the forecast a bit more directly. Financial markets have remained, I would say, remarkably optimistic overall. It's not like the tide has risen, but there are still a number of people, a number of countries that have struggled with market access. But overall, clearly stock valuations have staged a big recovery, and financial conditions remain quite accommodative, which is a godsend, of course, given how severe the impact of the crisis has been, and given the needs of governments to borrow extensively to protect the most vulnerable segments of the population, which are those, again, most likely to be employed in the sectors more severely hit by the crisis. But the last element I want to mention as of the recent developments is, of course, something we feel very strongly in the neck of the woods where I am now in Italy, is the huge rise in caseloads in Europe, a really strong second wave. We had some second wave of infections anticipated in our forecast, but clearly what has been happening has been more severe than we had anticipated. Even though the measures adopted so far by governments, we have learned from experience, have been a bit less restrictive, clearly, of those that were imposed in the spring. I would say that one lesson that was learned from the global financial crisis has been that you need massive policy support. I really think that made an enormous difference. I mentioned earlier the easy financial conditions, but if you zoom back to mid-March, we had 2 weeks from hell in markets, where really markets were in a tailspin. Governments were losing market access, stock prices were plummeting. And fundamentally, central banks stepped in very aggressively, the main central banks, both directly through monetary policy measures, through extended swap lines, and a variety of other facilities. And also the fiscal response, particularly in advanced economies, was very aggressive. And as a result of that, confidence returned to a point that people worry about a disconnect between the financial market optimism and the pace of the recovery. That's clearly a worry we have, that if the hopes of markets get dashed by delays in widespread vaccine availability or by increased infections, we may well be we have to be ready for another very severe, potentially very severe market correction. But still, this is clearly a better world to be in, given the enormous problems policymakers are facing, than one where you have rampant risk aversion and flight to safety and no market access. Let me give you a couple of slides on the forecast, and then I will turn more to the big uncertainties and the policy issues that Norman has so ably described in his presentation. Let me the structure of this slide has our forecast for 2021. For the first time since the COVID crisis started, we basically are sticking our necks out and providing also a 5-year forecast. Of course, the uncertainty is extreme. Is extreme for the current quarter, let alone 5 years down the road. But bear with me, and I will talk about uncertainties as well. Here, just focus on 2021 and the revisions compared to June. But if you see the bottom line, you see for the world economy that we expect world activity to recover in 2021 to a level that is marginally higher than the one it had in 2019. But that is clearly not the case for advanced economies as a whole, despite the fact that the recession is less severe than the one we were anticipating in June. We're still talking about a massive contraction, and you just have to scroll down the line to see the size of these negative numbers. It is really an unprecedented shock. If the GDP releases that we've had suggest some upside risk for the growth rate in 2020. Growth in the third quarter, which was not yet available when we finalized our projections, has turned out a bit stronger. So that's clearly a plus for our forecast. But of course, again, there is a second wave in train, and we're going to have to see how that plays out, particularly over the winter quarters, if you want, in the Northern Hemisphere, where a lot of world economic activity takes place. Let me turn to the projections for the emerging and developing world. And, if you look at the aggregate projection, which is the second column, what you see is that in the emerging world, there is a rebound to a level of activity considerably higher than the one in 2019, albeit if you have to compare to what trend growth was, we are talking about a massive downward revision for the level of economic activity compared to what we thought just 9 months ago. But if you actually take the trouble of removing the giant among emerging and developing economies, China, from the aggregate, you see a very different picture. Namely, for emerging markets and developing economies excluding China, GDP does not even recover its 2019 level as of next year. So while for China, you see the forecast is that economic activity is going to grow this year, albeit at a relatively modest pace, but grow much more strongly next year. So fundamentally, we are seeing a world where advanced economies are shrinking over 2021, emerging and developing economies, excluding China, are shrinking, and China is growing by 10%. I think it is a massive divergence of prospects, especially considering where it all started, really. So compared to what we were thinking in January, February, this looks like a world turned upside down. China was able to control the pandemic very effectively, draconian measures, but clearly has a number of cases that is a fraction of the one scaled by population that other countries have experienced. But you see across the board in other emerging and developing economies a very difficult situation. Look at the size of the contractions in countries like India. Mexico is actually not far from there in terms of growth for 2020. Brazil is also very negative. It is, and commodity exporters of oil, I would say, is not commodity in general, but clearly oil exporters have been hit very severely by the decline in prices, in addition to everything else happening, namely very severe infections in pace of infections in the Middle East. Now, of course, we are going to be wrong about the forecast. That's obvious. The uncertainties that characterize any forecasting exercise at the macroeconomic level, even in normal times, are just multiplied given the confluence of uncertainty between the economic side and the development of the pandemic side. But let me just cover very briefly a couple of key issues on our end. Obviously, if science does miracles, we all hope for science to do miracles, and not just to do miracles, but do them as quickly as possible. It is possible for economic activity to come back more rapidly than we currently envisage. And advances in therapies, or of course, a vaccine that is produced and distributed at the needed scale, could make such a difference. Incidentally, I think it's important when you look at these growth numbers, and you may think, oh boy, these numbers do not look realistic. These very high growth rates for 2021. I think it's very important that you focus on the level of GDP, because of course when you have a third of the economy shut down, as you had during the second quarter of 2020, the level of activity is going to be incredibly weak, and mechanically just the reopening of activity will be associated with rates of growth that under normal circumstances look extreme, but these are just rebounds in the level of GDP, not even to the level it had before. The problems that we face, of course, is that a bunch of growth hindering factors that were in place before the crisis, think of geopolitical tensions, trade policy, tariffs, plus uncertainty, frictions on the technology front, weather-related natural disasters, all those things are compounded by the risk that recurrent outbreaks are posing. And of course, as Norman pointed out, if you don't get a resolution of the health crisis, you're just not going to get a pace of recovery that is needed to restore livelihoods to more decent levels for a large fraction of the population. I will just gloss on this slide, but I just want to highlight, of course, that the combination of massive fiscal intervention plus a substantial decline in GDP has implied debt to GDP ratios that are much higher. Our view at the IMF in general is that it is governments have to be very aggressive, very targeted, but very aggressive in their fiscal responses for reasons I will elaborate on briefly. But clearly, there is a medium-term fiscal sustainability issue that is going to be something that will need to be dealt with, and hence commitments on tax reforms, on progressivity, on being very responsible in not implementing changes in policy that imply permanent increases in spending other than, for the most needed segments of the population, is going to be absolutely crucial to avoid seeing a cascade of debt crisis in the next few years, and debt restructurings as those we have seen in a number of countries that were vulnerable to start with. I close with a couple of slides on policy priorities, and you will see a lot of the themes that Norman was discussing earlier. There's just one general point I would like to make, that this is an enormously challenging situation for policymakers. It is an unprecedented crisis in many ways, and we just don't know the duration. So keeping firms alive, particularly in sectors where demand is going to come back, is extremely important. But then you wonder when demand will be coming back. It will come back, but when, we don't know. And will governments be able to bridge that, that gap for long enough, or should we think about sectoral reallocation more actively? It's a big debate, and again, I think there is no right or wrong answer. Of course, you want to facilitate labor force reallocation to the extent needed, but we don't know the extent needed, and it is once again easier said than done. I'm happy to come back to this theme if there are questions on this. Let me mention that we think you should be very careful about withdrawing support when reopening is underway. This is a supremely regressive crisis. It is hitting sectors that have a much higher share of population than of GDP. And this share of workers there is overrepresentation of the young, of women, and of people with relatively low level of skills, and it is just absolutely essential for governments to help these sectors, help these small and medium enterprises, help these people survive literally in some countries through this period with calibrated, precise, but substantial policy response. And let me close with the fact that we have, of course, huge medium-term challenges. We inherited slow productivity growth. Norman had some words of hope in that his presentation. He mentioned that crises do often engender the type of structural change that can lead to higher productivity growth. We do hope that is the case. We do hope to see that. Clearly, markets see it in increased digitalization and in the market valuation of a variety of firms. For now, unfortunately, we see the negative side of productivity. We see the enormous additional costs that certain sectors have to incur to continue to operate. Any person that has been to a doctor's visit or to a routine dentist visit since COVID started understands very well what hoops firms, in this case the medical care providers, need to go through to reduce infection risk. Those are clearly all factors that are sapping productivity growth. Let's hope that the move towards digitalization, together with science allowing a return of contact-intensive sectors, are going to offset those negative factors as quickly as possible. And in the WEO, we talk a lot this time about the transition to a low carbon economy. There's an entire real chapter with a medium-term focus that looks on this. But I would like to close on one sentence again that borrows from something that the brief discusses, and it's the need to boost human capital accumulation. Another way in which this crisis has been incredibly regressive has been in its hit on human capital accumulation. Think of young kids that cannot go to school, and those that have access to remote learning, to smaller classes, to the type of internet connections and computers that allow them to continue learning, are in a much better position than the large majority of youth, where really staying at home is a massive loss in progress in human capital accumulation. And there are a variety of studies that indicate how persistent the negative effects of lost schooling can be, and hence it is absolutely vital for that for schooling to continue as much as possible and consistent with the needed health requirements. Let me stop here, and again, I'm honored to be with you. I think the brief is really thought-provoking, extremely well done. I think we are on the same page in terms of priorities, and again, happy to come back as needed with questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gian Maria, for your remarks and presentation. I'd like to remind everyone, all participants, that you can send your questions to the panel through the chat, both in WebEx and through YouTube. We will now listen to Eric Parrado. Eric is currently Chief Economist at the Inter-American Development Bank, AIDB. Thank you, Eric, for being here.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Can you see me, and do you see the presentation?
We can see the presentation, but not you.
Okay, so let me check this. Give me 1 second. Okay, I'm going to start again then. So thank you very much, Andrea. It's a real pleasure to be with you. And I have to say that I'm in a really difficult position, given the quality of the previous presentation, but I will try to complement them in some way or another, trying to focus on different things and trying to complement the previous presentations on the narrative, on the focus on Latin America and the Caribbean, and also on the long-term view. So I'm really happy, and I'm very thankful for the invitation from the World Bank and Universidad Adolfo Ibañez, and a special thanks to Sergio and Julio for organizing this event. And it's a real honor to be with my fellow admired panelists, Andrea, Gian Maria, and Norman. So in this presentation, I'm planning to focus in a couple of issues related to Latin America and the Caribbean. So as a way of introduction, let me put together the summary of the contents of this presentation. And I have to say that, first of all, similar to Norman and to Gian Maria comments, we have to think about emerging market economies with pre-existent problems. And in the case of our region, Latin America and the Caribbean, we're thinking about low productivity, political polarization, and social problems. I'm using an analogy here in terms that Latin America and the Caribbean was like an airplane flying with a damaged engine in 2019 because of these problems of low productivity, political polarization, and social unrest. And we enter with this plane in 2020, and then the other engine was damaged because of the pandemic. And now the pilot and the crew are trying to fly this plane to save the passengers and also to save the plane, which is the economy, trying to find a safer place land and then to repair and check the health of these passengers. So I think we are in a situation that we are trying to fix some problems, but we are having really, really important persistent problems. And that's why in this narrative, we call it that the region, and particularly Latin America and the Caribbean, is suffering a triple sunstop in terms of the impacts and the different mechanisms that hit the region. I'm going to explain later all the details regarding this idea of the triple sunstop. And moreover, Latin America now is the global epicenter, not only in terms of the economic impact, but also in the impact on health. And I'm going to show you a couple of numbers there. And the problem of this is that we're going to have a crisis, not only in terms of what we're living today, but also in terms of debt that is going to increase, and probably the costs are also increasing in time. So we have to do reforms to avoid a debt crisis, I would say, and also try to keep macroeconomic sustainability. And of course, the role of multilaterals will be key to supporting the recovery. So in terms of the pre-existing problems, I'm trying to take a long-term perspective and compare, for instance, what happened with per capita income relative to the per capita income in the US. And you can see that we have done a really lousy job in terms of closing this gap. So here is a comparison between Latin America and emerging Asia, and the contrast is quite evident in terms of closing this type of gaps. And when we take a look to growth in the region, so here we have a comparison between 2007 along several years up to 2018. And we can see that the weighted average in terms of economic growth for all the region was really high 1 year before the global crisis in 2008-2009. So 2007 was 5.6%. And now in 2019, the weighted average is only 0.1%. So there is a huge decline in terms of economic growth in the region. And if you want to find the culprits of this growth, the lack of productivity is the main culprit in terms of the impact on the region. And you can see here in this picture that if you compute the different contributions in terms of factors like capital, education, labor, and productivity, the productivity component, it's negative in the case of Latin America, and in contrast to emerging Asia, which is really, really, really important. So now we have to focus and try to find sources of productivity in our region if we want to grow in the future. So regarding the impact and the narrative on the impact of the region, we are calling this that we're suffering a triple sunstop. And it's triple because we have the first sunstop related to human mobility. So all the lockdowns imposed in all the countries in the region, which are really restrictive if you make a comparison with other regions, also the travel restrictions. So this is the first sunstop, and it has a huge impact on economic activity and also in tourism, which is really important for some countries, for instance, in the Caribbean. The second sunstop is related to trade. This is related to volumes and also prices. Of course, this is the first assessment that we have during the first months of the pandemic, March and April. And in addition to that, we have the impact on financial flows, not only capital outflows going from out of the region, but also in terms of the impact on remittances. And I'm going to explain a little bit about that. And if you want to understand all the details regarding this narrative about the triple sunstop, here is a op-ed that was published recently in Project Syndicate. And the thing, when we try to compare what is happening in terms of the management of public health and also the economy, Latin America is not doing a really good job. So here, for instance, you will find a couple of red lines, which are the averages in terms of economic growth. This is the projection of the IMF that Maria mentioned, is minus 4.4, and also in terms of the average of deaths over million of population. And several countries, probably a large number of countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, are in the worst quadrant, where we cannot save lives, and also we have a huge impact on economic growth. And so this discussion about the trade-off is not holding here in the region. So that's why we said that Latin America and the Caribbean is becoming the epicenter of the pandemic, both in terms of health impacts and also in terms of the economic impacts. In terms of containment measures have proved effective at reducing mobility. Here we have a partnership with Waze, this traffic application, and when we can see that the lockdowns reduce mobility at the end of March and April, and then now is recovering gradually. I think the recovery is much important in Brazil and also in Uruguay, but in other countries it's still lower than pre-pandemic levels. In terms of air passengers data, the shock has been huge. And if we compare, for instance, number of air passengers in terms of year-on-year change, you can see that the impact has been really significant. And this has an impact, of course, in economic activity and tourism, as we said before. And finally, in terms of the third pillar of this 3% stop is related to financial flows. And we can see that in terms of, this is just an example, in terms of bond flows, we have that the accumulative impact is not recovering. Only in Colombia is recovering, but on the other countries, it will take more time. And given the uncertainty, we don't know if this will continue or not. In terms of remittances, at the beginning, we have a really pessimistic scenario. Now we updated the different projections in terms of the impact on remittances, and now our baseline scenario is a reduction of remittances of around 5%, but probably we're going to be more on the optimistic side of -2%. As a way of comparison, the global financial crisis had an impact of 12% negative in 2009. So I think we're going to be in a better situation here if we make this comparison. And what is the main reason? We have a hypothesis, and we think that remittances are not going to be hit so hard because the unprecedented U.S. fiscal policy expansion. So here, when you have remittances econometric models, you always compare GDP growth between countries, and we now are considering disposable income. And disposable income in the U.S. Has increased significantly, and that has an spillover on remittances, and that's why now we're using disposable income as a way to explain the behavior of remittances in the region. So I think this is a secondary effect in terms of the U.S. fiscal expansion. International trade suffered significantly during the first months of the pandemic, but now we can see some recovery both in volumes and prices. All commodity prices are recovering except for oil. I would say if you make a comparison in terms of pre-pandemic terms, but the uncertainty is too high to say, okay, this is going to be like the new normal in some way in terms of trade. The impact on GDP growth, I'm showing this GDP growth in Q2. The impact has been huge and probably is going to be one of the largest decline in quarterly terms if we make a comparison with the history. But probably in Q3 and Q4, we're going to see negative numbers, but not so negative like in this quarter. What are the growth scenarios? In the case of our own projections in our macroeconomic report is between -8% and -10% for Latin America and the Caribbean, probably with the new sectoral data from Brazil, especially from Brazil, probably we're going to end up between -6 to -7%. But of course, again, a lot of uncertainty in terms of these projections, and it will depend on if we have another wave in terms of the impact of the pandemic. So that is going to be important. And in contrast, to have some contrast with the IMF projection, probably we're thinking more in a U-shaped projection rather than a V-shaped projection, given that the impact, it will take some time. And because we have to understand that the crisis will end when we have the vaccine. Now there are some good news in terms of the invention of the vaccine, but it's going to be really challenging the production and also the distribution to all the regions in the world. So it will take some time. The impact on employment has been huge so far. Here, using data from our labor observatory, we can see that there are 24 million jobs lost in between February and July, and probably we're going to end up with more than 40 million people unemployed. This is very interesting. Here we put together a survey on 17 countries. We have more than 220,000 answers from this survey around Latin America and the Caribbean, and we can see that the impact on poorer households in terms of job losses is huge. So the percentage of households impacted by job losses is going to be huge. Here, for instance, the poor households have 70 to 80% in terms of job losses. And in contrast with richer households, we have this number in 10 to 20%. So we have also an impact not only in terms of poor people, but also we're going to have an impact in terms of income distribution. This is interesting because this is a question related to telework, and we can see that it's very difficult for people to work from home, at least in poorer families. So that's why, despite the fact that you have very restricted lockdowns, it's very difficult to manage this because, of course, many people are trying to find jobs or trying to find some source of income. In terms of the recovery, it will take some time. It will take 3 to 4 years to get back to the pre-crisis income per capita, and this was really low in terms of the average, just 1.6 per annum. But the challenge will be to try to reduce this area, this triangle, in the future. But it's going to be really challenging because the fiscal space is narrowing as we speak. If we compare, for instance, debt levels between 2008 and 2018, there is a huge difference in terms of public debt. Now the levels are much higher. So if we make a comparison between 2008, public debt over GDP was 44%. Now in 2018 is 57%. And our own projection is that in 2022, debt over GDP is going to be almost 80%. So we're going to have a huge challenge in terms of how to deal with debt. And here, just to finish, because I have only 3 minutes more, a recommendation in terms of the strategy for the short term and long term. We call it here that we're suffering and we're in a pandemic tunnel, and we have a dilemma. And the dilemma is that we have some uncertainties in terms of how long is the tunnel, and we don't know what will the world look like when exiting the tunnel. So I think that's going to be important in terms of the uncertainties. But what we know is that the region will become more indebted, poorer, more unequal, and going back to pre-crisis policies will not be enough for the recovery. So I think we need to think about a strategy in terms of trying to find higher growth than before the crisis. And this will mean that we need to find a virtuous circle in terms of trying to support our economy in terms of the sanitary and preservation measures. We need to find also reforms in terms of inclusive growth. and trying to have access to credit markets. I think that's the combination that emerging markets they have to try to find, and also it's really important for several countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. What are the priorities? Preservation policies, or in terms of health preservation, economic preservation, of course. And I think this is not enough. And we need to make some changes in terms of finding reforms for growth with a new social contract, with a long-term view, in terms of having more opportunities and more equity in public policy. So I will finish here to be on time and get back to you, Andrea. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric, very much for your presentation and your remarks. And thanks to all the participants who have been sending their questions through the different chats in the meantime. There are many questions about the environment in the different chats of this event. Let me start asking you, Norman, about the policy brief and your summary of similarities across crises. How does the current crisis compare to the upcoming climate change crisis, according to your analysis?
Thanks, Andrea, and thanks to people who pose these questions in relation to environmental sustainability. So we may actually think of this pandemic as a shortened version of what a climate change crisis could be. In fact, this climate crisis could have all these characteristics of being at the same time a demand and a supply shock, of being very uncertain, of being global, and of having consequences that will affect especially the poorest countries or the least advantaged members of society. So maybe the similarities are there. The difference is, as I said before, is that this climate change crisis would last not maybe a couple of years or maybe a decade, but actually many decades. And this is why it is so important to prepare for it. But actually, this also allows me to develop an issue that I didn't do sufficiently in my presentation. And this is the question of how to invest in clean energy and in more sustainable growth. I didn't touch explicitly on this point, but actually I did it implicitly under the heading of high quality public investment. This is really important, and it has to do with the ability of governments now to provide the infrastructure for a recovery that is better and that is also greener. And this actually poses this dilemma, because it may be actually easier to now invest in sources of energy that are not environmentally sustainable in the long run. For instance, coal-based or oil-based, or just tapping the same non-renewable resources. And that could be the inclination of most countries that want to recover quickly. They may want to do that. But if they don't have really quick recovery in mind, if this is not really a target, but they are more thinking about protecting the sources of growth for resilience and for the long run, then they may want to think that these cheap sources of energy and maybe low quality public investment is not the best way of moving forward, and they should prefer other sources.
Thank you, Norman. Eric and Jean-Maria, how do you see this? Can pandemic rescue packages go hand in hand with environmental sustainability? Are countries following this path, or is there a tension between short-term recovery and long-term sustainability? How do you see this, Eric?
I don't think so. And I think we have to avoid this conventional wisdom that there is a trade-off between economic growth and sustainability. And And let me give you an example, a very concrete example in terms of what we have proposed in the recent months. And we have proposed that, for instance, pension funds and sovereign wealth funds should invest in sustainable funds, specifically in ESG funds with certification on environment issues, social issues, and governance issues. So, for instance, in Chile, and we are from Chile, Andrea and myself, and we have this discussion regarding pension funds. And one of the important discussions related to the use of funds, but also related to the investments, is that we don't have the possibility to invest in sustainable companies. So one of our proposals is to find different funds with the ESG component, and we have measured and we did a counterfactual exercise that there is no missing returns if you invest in this type of companies. So with this idea, you can find sources for growth, but at the same time, you can have an impact, a positive impact on sustainability. So that's one really concrete ideas in terms of trying to avoid this conventional wisdom in terms of having this trade-off.
Thank you, Eric. Maria, how do you see this issue about the environment?
I agree with previous speakers. Clearly, there is scope for measures that are helpful in sustaining economic activity and at the same time promote a gradual transformation of the economy in a green direction that is from infrastructure investment. You will need, of course, to alter the tax system to allow for carbon taxation. That has to be one plank of the of a move to a greener economy. But there is, I think, plenty of scope to move in that direction. We had a big fall in oil prices. There's a lot of scope to generate revenues by cutting subsidies, as was done during the previous crisis, talking more about emerging and developing economies that spend a fortune in some cases on energy subsidies, which are not the most efficient form of redistribution for sure. But we are devoting an entire WIO chapter on sort of trying to meet the goal of preventing large-scale temperature increases and what an overall macro policy package could look like. And I would invite people that are interested in this to take a look at it. It's a very dense chapter. It's impossible for me to summarize in a few words. But I think this is clearly an opportunity to tackle headfirst these environmental concerns. You have some emerging economies, some of the largest emitters, think of China, that are explicitly now designing strategies to reduce emissions. I think it is time. The time has come. Clearly, if you look at social surveys, not just at economic policy statements, that is the way things should move, and this is the way people want them to move.
Thank you. There are also a number of questions about the shape of the recovery. Let me start by you, Norman. Somebody's asking you directly, which countries are more likely to follow a V-shaped recovery versus an L-shaped recovery? Some people are adding to that question whether the political environment matters, corruption, what are the differences across, let's say, Latin American countries or Asian countries. Do you have would you make bets on shapes and on the correlations with other, on the context of these countries and regions?
Well, yes, thanks, Andrea. I can offer some remarks. Well, V-shape is like the best case scenario, as I said during my presentation. You are hit by a shock, and then you're able to recover, bounce back quickly, and that seems to be what China is doing. But China is probably the exception around the world. Now, the other extreme is an L-shaped. And the L-shaped non-recovery or lack of recovery really means that it really occurs in countries that are not only unable to manage the pandemic, but also produce, engender other crises. And this crisis may be related to, as I said before, debt management, could be related to financial crisis, but they may also be related to political crisis, to social unrest, to cases, to dictatorship, and so on. And we see already, and actually in different countries, especially in the developing world, that this has become a threat. So it's really an open question now, whether social unrest and political instability will be one of the crises that will actually make the recovery from this pandemic more difficult than it could be.
Thank you, Norman. And Eric, in the same line, how can China's recovery benefit developing countries, say through a higher demand for commodities or other goods and services coming from these countries, countries that export these goods to China?
That's an important question, because our linkages in terms of trade with China and also in terms of financing for some countries in Latin America and the Caribbean is really important. So I think China is recovering, as Maria mentioned, and Norman too. So we count on that in terms of trying to continue supporting trade in terms of our commodities. And we can see the numbers that is behaving like that. PMIs in China are much better than before. But of course, given the uncertainty that we have in terms of controlling the pandemic, and at the same time, the positive news of the vaccine, I think we are in a race in terms of which type of impact is more impactful in net terms. So I think it's important that China recover, but at the same time, we need to do our job in terms of not finding sleepy countries when China really woke up.
That's a nice way of putting it. Gian Maria, you mentioned supply chains in your presentation. Developed countries have incentives to move critical supply chains now out of developing countries, for instance, out of manufacturing developing countries like China and India. Someone in the public asked whether multilateral cooperation can avoid this possibility. How do you see this?
Well, let me first clarify some, you have to be a bit synthetic in your slides, and you cannot put all the detail you need. There are some critical supply chains in regard to medical equipment. There are some critical supply chains in regard to production of medicine. And that is what we were referring to, where we were talking about, ensuring the functionality of critical supply chains is not auto manufacturers here. We're talking about, again, emergency needs, health needs for the recovery. And, it is, for macroeconomists, it is sobering, and I think at the same time fascinating to look at how these markets actually work, where production takes place, how concentrated it is. That is true, including for vaccines, looking at that market, where the stuff is produced, who produces the necessary inputs, and all of those things we never worry about in normal times. Now, there is a more general question, which is a question we were worrying about before the pandemic hits, which is what is going to happen to supply chains with increased trade and technological tensions between superpowers. The honest answer is that so far we have mostly anecdotal evidence on this, rather than because the data lag substantially. And it is clearly possible that you will see more fragmentation. But the resilience of supply chains is not guaranteed by, say, moving your production closer to home. Shocks happen, and shocks happen to your country too. And we've seen it this round. when China was back in business by April, and fundamentally nobody else was operating in manufacturing because of the lockdowns elsewhere. And considering the size of the markets in China and India, short of extreme cases of technological fragmentation and increasing tensions, it is unlikely that firms are going to sidestep the presence in markets of that size. But of course, it is possible that you will see some rejiggling over the next few years, and a lot, of course, will depend on how these technology and trade tensions will evolve. Andrea, you're on mute. Okay.
Children say all the time. We don't have much time left, so let me finish with a closing question for each of you. The saying goes that crises are opportunities. Are you optimistic about countries taking advantage of the current crisis, facing, it's in the policy brief, for example, informality or equity in health and education, or the political environment I'm thinking about in Latin America, governments that do not finish their mandates, withdrawals from the pension systems to finance the emergency, might make you more, put you on the pessimistic side. You can also take the opportunity to make any closing remarks you'd like to make. Let's start by you, Norman.
I've remained optimistic. I think that there is the possibility for reform, but this is not something that, reform is not something that just happens. It's not something exogenous. It's something that we can drive. It's something that we can influence. And we are speaking from the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the International Monetary Fund, universities like Adolfo Ibañez in Chile. And I think if we have to make a group force for reform. So reform can happen if we are strong enough in pushing forward with these ideas. So that's the optimistic side. And my final remark has to do with the vaccine. I think I agree very much with Eric and something that Maria also mentioned, that the vaccine may have been invented and maybe we will have one available soon. But there are logistical, political, and financial issues in relation to the implementation of the vaccine around the world. And the faster we do this, the better we do this, the faster and stronger the recovery will be. And this is something that I believe we are not yet prepared. There is not enough global cooperation for this to happen.
Thank you, Norman, very much for your policy brief and for all your thoughts. Gian Maria, are you pessimistic? Are you optimistic? How do you see the future in the short run and the medium term?
I am hopeful that science will come to the rescue. And I think Norman made an enormously important point now about picking up on what Eric also mentioned. It's not that straightforward. Having a vaccine does not imply having everybody vaccinated, especially given the enormous, also practical difficulties, the temperature at which these have to be kept and all that. And we have to think about therapeutics as hard as we do about vaccines, And multilateral cooperation in this area is absolutely essential, and it has been lacking. And we are all multilaterals, and of course we push that angle, but a lot of it will depend on political will, and we're going to have to see where this pans out. But it is going to be a very hard challenge. I mean, I think if science helps, the one large difference with respect to previous crises is that there is no structural decline, I think, in demand for contact intensive services. If anything, demand for contact intensive services was growing. And it's basically a victim of the pandemic. If we manage to restore you know, the conditions for people to mingle, to travel, to go out, they will do so. The demand is there, and so things may come back faster than on that angle that we currently envisage. But unfortunately, the risks are huge and the uncertainties are huge. We just don't know yet how long that might take. And considering the thin, social protection layers that these people have, particularly in emerging and developing economies, thin or non-existent, this is a massive issues and a big risk. And I think the international community has to step up, not just on the vaccine front and health front, but it will have to step up in other ways to help countries that are going to be with their back against the wall.
Thank you, Gian Maria. Eric, how about you?
Despite the huge challenges, I'm optimistic. But to elaborate this, let me give you a mini story regarding San Agustin. Augustine, before being a saint, he really enjoyed life, and he had a really hedonistic life. But he knew that he had to change. So one day he knelt and he said, "Okay, God, give me chastity and continence, but not yet." And that's the problem of Latin America and the Caribbean, or any emerging market, that we procrastinate and we postpone what we need to do, because we need the reforms that we need to implement sooner than later. And I think the pandemic is a wake-up call to say we cannot procrastinate anymore. We have to do things, otherwise the problems are going to be much, much bigger. And that's, I think, in my positive view, to say, okay, it's compulsory to put together good reforms and try to have a better outlook in terms of inclusive growth.
Thank you, Norman. Thank you, Gian Maria. Thank you, Eric, for being today here in this event. I'll let Sergio and Julio close our seminar today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Norman, Gian Maria, Eric, for the excellent presentations. It has been a wonderful panel. We already received requests for the presentations, which will be making available in the website of the event to the extent that you agree to share them. We will also post links to the documents, the relevant documents that you have produced at the different institutions. We will also make the video available. So with all that, thank you very much, the Universidad Adolfo Ibañez, the Malaysia Center, the Chile Center, the Chile World Bank Office, for all the help in implementing this wonderful event. And we look forward to having more events in the future. Thank you very much.
Everyone, goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.